The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a plain manila envelope with a Department of Veterans Affairs return address. I was sorting through my mail at the kitchen table when I saw it. Addressed to my grandmother, Evelyn Mercer, who'd been dead for 11 years. I opened it anyway. Inside was a single-page notice stating that the pension file for Staff Sergeant Thomas Mercer had been reopened due to a routine audit of unresolved cases from the Korean War. The letter requested that next of kin provide updated contact information and documentation for verification purposes. I stared at the name. Thomas Mercer, my uncle, my father's older brother, the man who'd been declared missing in action in 1951 and presumed dead a year later. The man whose name was etched on a memorial stone in Arlington National Cemetery, even though no body had ever been recovered. I'd heard stories about him growing up. My grandmother had kept a photo of him in uniform on the mantel until the day she died. My father rarely spoke about him, but when he did, it was always with a kind of distant sadness, as if talking about Thomas hurt too much to do often. Now, 73 years later, the government was reopening his file. I was 49 years old, a high school history teacher living in the same small Pennsylvania town where I'd grown up. My father had passed away 6 years ago. I was the last living relative who remembered hearing Thomas's name spoken aloud. My older sister lived in California and barely kept in touch. My younger brother had died in a car accident 15 years ago. I called the number on the letter the next day. A woman named Ms. Harmon answered. I explained who I was and why I was calling. She said the audit had been triggered by a cross-reference with Social Security Administration records. Apparently, someone with Thomas Mercer's Social Security number had been receiving benefits for the past 40 years. I said that wasn't possible. Thomas had been declared dead in 1952. She said that was why they were investigating. She asked if I had any documentation, discharge papers, death certificates, anything that might help clarify the discrepancy. I said I'd look. I spent the weekend going through boxes in my father's attic. I found old photos, letters from the war. A Purple Heart that had been awarded posthumously. I found my grandmother's correspondence with the War Department from the early 50s, each letter more desperate than the last, asking for information about her son. I also found something I hadn't expected. Tucked inside an old photo album was a letter dated 1962, addressed to my grandmother from a man named Paul Hendricks. The letter was brief and cryptic. Mrs. Mercer, I'm writing to tell you that your son may not be dead. I served with him in Korea. I saw him after the battle where he was reported missing. He was alive. I don't know where he went, but I thought you should know. I'm sorry I didn't write sooner. Paul Hendricks. I read it 3 times. My grandmother had never mentioned this letter. My father had never mentioned it. It had been hidden in an album for over 60 years. I called Ms. Harmon back and told her about the letter. She said it complicated things, but it might also explain the Social Security discrepancy. She said the VA would need to investigate further. She asked if I'd be willing to cooperate with their inquiry. I said yes. 2 weeks later, I received a call from a VA investigator named Robert Klein. He said they'd traced the Social Security benefits to an address in Oregon. The benefits had been deposited into a bank account under the name Thomas Mercer for the past 42 years. The account was still active. I asked if anyone had verified that it was actually him. Klein said that was what he was trying to do. He asked if I'd be willing to provide a DNA sample for comparison. I agreed. A week later, Klein called again. He said they'd located Thomas Mercer. He was alive, living in a small town outside Portland. He was 94 years old. I didn't know what to say. I sat down at my kitchen table and stared at the wall. Klein said Thomas had been living under his own name for decades. He'd never tried to hide. He'd been receiving veterans' benefits, Social Security, Medicare. He'd been working odd jobs, paying taxes, living quietly. I asked why no one had ever noticed. Klein said the system wasn't as connected back then. Records were kept in different departments. When Thomas applied for Social Security in the early 80s, no one flagged that he'd been declared dead 30 years earlier. The computers weren't sophisticated enough to catch it. I asked if Thomas knew that everyone thought he was dead. Klein said he'd have to ask him. I flew to Oregon 3 weeks later. Klein met me at the airport and drove me to a small assisted living facility on the outskirts of town. He said Thomas had been living there for the past 5 years. He was in relatively good health for his age, though his memory was starting to fade. Klein said, "I should warn you. He's not what you might expect." I said, "What do you mean?" Klein said, "He's not sentimental. He's not looking for a reunion." When I told him you were coming, he didn't seem surprised. He just nodded. We walked into the facility. It was clean, quiet, with pale yellow walls and soft lighting. Klein led me to a common room where an old man sat by a window, looking out at the parking lot. He was small, thin, with white hair and deeply lined skin. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans. He didn't look up when we approached. Klein said, "Mr. Mercer, this is your niece." Thomas turned his head slowly. He looked at me with pale blue eyes that were both sharp and distant. I said, "I'm Anna, your brother David's daughter." He nodded. He said, "I remember David." I sat down in the chair next to him. Klein stood by the door, giving us space but staying close. I said, "Everyone thought you were dead." Thomas said, "I know." I said, "Why didn't you come home?" He looked back out the window. He said, "Because I didn't want to. I waited." He didn't elaborate. I said, "Your mother spent the rest of her life grieving you. She never stopped hoping you were alive." He said, "I'm sorry about that." I said, "That's all you have to say." He said, "What do you want me to say?" I made a choice. I left. I didn't want to be that person anymore. I said, "What person?" He said, "The son, the brother, the soldier." I didn't want any of it. I said, "So you just disappeared?" He said, "Yes." I sat there, trying to process what I was hearing. I'd flown across the country expecting answers, maybe even an apology. What I got was indifference. I said, "Did you ever think about us? About what it would do to your family?" He said, "Sometimes. But not enough to come back." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because I was happier gone." Klein stepped forward. He said, "Mr. Mercer, we need to address the benefits you've been receiving. You were declared dead in 1952. Legally, you shouldn't have been eligible for any payments." Thomas said, "I didn't lie. I gave them my real name, my real social security number. They sent me the checks. I cashed them." Klein said, "But you knew you'd been declared dead." Thomas said, "I figured someone would catch it eventually." They didn't. Klein said, "The VA is going to want restitution. You've received over $800,000 in benefits you weren't entitled to." Thomas shrugged. He said, "I don't have $800,000. I spent it living." Klein said, "We'll need to work that out." I said, "What happened in Korea? Why did you leave?" Thomas looked at me. He said, "We were ambushed. Half my unit was killed. I got separated from the others. I was injured hiding in a bombed out building. A local family found me. They hid me, fed me, kept me alive. When I was strong enough to move, I realized I didn't want to go back. So I didn't." I said, "You just walked away." He said, "I traded my dog tags with a dead soldier. I let them think I was dead. I made my way south, crossed into Japan, worked on fishing boats for a few years. Eventually I made it to the States, started over." I said, "And you never told anyone?" He said, "Who was I going to tell?" I said, "Your family." He said, "My family wanted me to be someone I wasn't. The military wanted me to kill people I didn't know. I didn't want any of it, so I left." I said, "And you've been living here under your own name for 40 years?" He said, "More or less." I said, "And no one ever questioned it?" He said, "A few people asked if I'd served. I said yes. They thanked me." That was it. I stood up. I didn't know what else to say. I'd come looking for closure, for some kind of understanding. What I found was an old man who'd chosen his own freedom over everyone else's grief. I said, "I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did to my grandmother." He said, "I'm not asking you to." I left. Klein drove me back to the airport. He said, "I'm sorry that wasn't what you hoped for." I said, "What happens now?" He said, "The VA will pursue restitution. It'll probably go through the courts. Given his age and financial situation, they'll likely settle for whatever assets he has." "It won't be much," I said. "And then what?" He said, "Then it's over. He'll live out his days here. The file will be closed." I flew home. I didn't tell my sister. I didn't tell anyone. I just sat with it. A month later, I received a letter from the VA. They'd reached a settlement with Thomas. He'd agreed to turn over his small savings account and his veterans' benefits. In exchange, they wouldn't pursue criminal charges. The case was closed. I thought about calling him. I thought about writing a letter. In the end, I didn't do either. 6 months later, Klein called to tell me Thomas had died. Heart failure. He'd passed quietly in his sleep. Klein said, "He left something for you." A week later, a package arrived. Inside was a small wooden box. Inside the box was a photograph. A young man in a Korean War uniform, standing with a group of soldiers. On the back, in faded ink, was written, "Pusan 1950. There was also a letter. "Anna, I know you think I'm a coward. Maybe I am. But I lived the life I wanted, not the one I was told to live. I'm sorry for the pain that caused. I'm not sorry for the choice." Thomas, I put the photo on my mantel, next to the one my grandmother had kept for so many years. I don't look at it often, but it's there. I think about Thomas sometimes. I think about the family he left behind, the mother who never stopped grieving, the brother who carried that grief quietly until he died. I think about the choice he made, to walk away from everything, to live as a ghost for 70 years. I don't know if I understand it. I don't know if I ever will. But I know he lived. And maybe, in his own way, that was enough for him. If you've ever uncovered a truth that someone buried for a lifetime, you're not alone.